I never thought that my son's wedding day would be the day I understood most clearly where I stood in his life. My name is Evelyn Parker. That year, I was 71 years old. I sat in the front row, hands resting neatly on my lap, back straight, watching my son Daniel standing at the altar. He wore a dark blue suit, a little awkward as always, smiling at the woman beside him, his bride, Laura. The reception was held at a small riverside hotel. Everything was neat, beautiful, exactly the way Laura wanted it. White flowers, golden candles, soft music. I remember thinking that, at the very least, Daniel looked happy, and for a mother, sometimes that is enough. After the speeches and applause, I stood near the gift table talking with a few old acquaintances. I was telling a story about Daniel as a child when Laura walked over. She was with two friends. In her hand was a glass of wine that was still far from empty. Laura called my name, not quietly, loud enough for the people around us to hear. Evelyn, I think we need to make one thing clear. I turned around, slightly surprised. Before I could say anything, she continued, her voice firm and unmistakably direct. Starting tomorrow, you need to understand that you are no longer Daniel's family. Daniel has a new family now, and I am the most important person in his life. I am the one who decides things. I am the one who comes first. The space around us suddenly felt strangely quiet. I could hear the background music still playing. I could hear someone clear their throat behind me. I did not argue. I did not ask her to repeat herself. I looked at Laura very carefully, not to look for drunkenness or a moment of recklessness. There was none. In her eyes was certainty, the belief that she was speaking from a position she fully owned. I smiled, a small, calm smile. In that moment, I understood this was not a careless remark. A boundary had just been drawn. And once a boundary is spoken out loud, there is no pretending. You never heard it. I stepped away from the gift table, took my phone out of my purse, and did one very simple thing. No one noticed. No one knew. But that moment changed everything. If you're listening to this and still believe that family is something worth protecting, that kindness does not mean enduring everything in silence, I invite you to stay and subscribe to this channel. This is a place for people who share my values, as I do. That night, as I drove home alone, I did not cry. I thought about only one thing. In life, there are moments when love is not about giving more, but about knowing when to stop. And that was when I began to look back on my entire journey as a mother. I have never considered myself a special person. I am simply a woman who has lived long enough to understand that everything has a price, even peace of mind. I worked as an accountant for more than 40 years. The job was not glamorous. It did not make me rich quickly, but it taught me one very clear lesson. No number is ever correct by accident. Everything needs to be checked, needs time, and requires honesty. My husband passed away when Daniel was only 10 years old. From that day on, it was just the two of us. I did not have many choices. I went to work consistently, came home on time, cooked meals, checked homework, and saved every small amount I could. I did not raise my son with grand lectures. I simply tried to live uprightly so he could see it every day. I never forced Daniel to be like me. I only hoped he would become a decent person, someone who takes responsibility for his own decisions. Perhaps because of that, as he grew older, I constantly reminded myself to step back, not to interfere, not to impose. My faith does not come from books or sermons. I simply believe that when you do the right thing, even when no one is watching, life does not ignore it. It may not pay back immediately, but it will. I believe in consequences in the simplest sense. The way someone treats others is the same way they will eventually have to face the world, not as punishment, but as understanding. When Daniel became an adult and had a stable job, I told myself I had finished the hardest part. What remained was learning how to stand on the sidelines, not interfering when it was unnecessary, not reacting before the time was right. But one question always stayed in my mind, especially as Daniel prepared to get married. When a child grows up, how far should a mother step back? How far is still love? And from what point does it become neglect? I didn't have a definite answer. I only knew that I did not want to become a controlling mother. And I also did not want to become a mother who stays so silent that her child is in danger, yet calls it respect. The night after the wedding, I sat alone in the kitchen, drinking cold tea. I thought about what Laura had said. I was not angry. I simply saw one thing more clearly. Some people enter your family not to connect, but to rearrange the order according to their own design. And when that happens, kindness is no longer about closing your eyes and letting it pass. It is about having the courage to look straight at the situation and accept that some boundaries must be held, even if it means being misunderstood. I did not know then how far things would go. I only knew that from that moment on, I could no longer pretend that everything was still fine the way it had been before. Daniel's change did not happen suddenly. It unfolded slowly, slow enough that, without paying close attention, one might think it was simply maturity. Daniel used to call me every weekend, not always for long, but consistently. After he met Laura, the calls became less frequent, once every 2 weeks, then once a month. When I called, he still answered, still polite, but the conversations were shorter. He often said he was busy, that everything was fine. I did not blame him. I thought perhaps he was building his own life. I had been that age. Once. I understood the desire to make your own decisions. The first time I met Laura was at a dinner Daniel invited me to. She was polite and well-spoken, asking me a few questions about my former work. But whenever Daniel began to share a childhood memory, Laura would interrupt, not sharply, just by steering the conversation elsewhere, gentle, yet decisive. I noticed that Daniel was quieter when Laura was beside him. He looked at her before answering, not to ask permission, but rather to check whether his response was appropriate. The second time, I invited both of them to my house for dinner. Laura arrived late. She apologized, explaining that it was due to work. Throughout the meal, her phone stayed on the table. When I asked Daniel about the wedding plans, Laura answered on his behalf. The date, the venue, the guest list. Everything had already been decided. Daniel nodded along with each thing she said. I said nothing. I only observed. I did not want to turn vague feelings into accusations. I had lived long enough to know that not everything that makes us uncomfortable is wrong. Sometimes it is simply different. But one thing unsettled me. Daniel began to speak less about his work. He would often discuss new projects and long-term plans. Now he did not. When I asked, he said things were being reorganized, that Laura was helping him see things more clearly. I did not object. I simply nodded. I told myself that perhaps I was worrying too much. When someone enters a serious relationship, they often undergo significant changes. That I needed to respect that. Yet the unease remained, not clear, not enough to name. Just a familiar feeling, like when you review a set of numbers and sense that something doesn't add up, even though you can't yet point to which line is wrong. I told no one. I did not tell Daniel either. I believed that if something was truly wrong, it would reveal itself. And if I intervened too early, I might become the one who ruined my child's happiness. So I chose silence. Not because I did not care, but because I was waiting to see where things would go without pressure from me. I began preparing Daniel's wedding gift very early, not because I was wealthy, but because I was accustomed to doing things with a plan. That money was not a sum I withdrew in a single day. It was money I had saved little by little over many years. Sometimes I put in less and sometimes I put in more. I always thought it would be a foundation for Daniel to begin his new life, not for indulgence, but for stability. I told Daniel about the gift a few weeks before the wedding. He was silent for a moment, then hugged me. I could feel how moved he was. He said he had never imagined I would prepare so much. I told him it was simply something I wanted to do. When I gave the gift on the wedding day, Daniel held my hand very tightly. I saw his eyes redden. In that moment, I had no regrets. I believed I had fulfilled my role as a mother. Laura stood beside him. She took the envelope from my hand, glanced at it, then nodded. She did not ask anything further. She did not thank me directly. She only said, briefly, that this would help them move faster with their plan to buy a house. That sentence was not harsh, nor was it rude, but it made me pause for a few seconds. I did not react. I did not correct her words. I simply smiled and stepped away to speak with someone else. A very clear thought formed in my mind. Some people see a gift as an offering. Others see it as an expected part of their plan. I am not saying either way is right or wrong, but I knew I was standing before two very different ways of thinking. That evening, when I returned home, I opened my savings book again and looked at the final number. I did not feel regret. I only felt that I needed to observe more closely, not to take back what I had given, but to better understand to whom I had given it. I believe money does not corrupt people on its own. It simply reveals more clearly what is already there. And if something is not quite right, it will eventually come to light. There is no need to rush to point it out. I still trusted Daniel. I also wanted to believe that Laura was only concerned about the future. But somewhere inside me, caution had begun to appear. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a very small step back in my heart. Enough that I was no longer completely at ease as I once had been. The reception went exactly as planned. Everything flowed smoothly, politely, with nothing unusual if viewed from the outside. I sat at a table near the stage with a few old acquaintances. Daniel was busy greeting guests. Laura was always at the center, talking, laughing, moving quickly. She controlled the rhythm of the room in a very natural way, as if she had been used to doing so for a long time. After people had a few drinks, the atmosphere grew louder. I stood up and walked toward the gift table. I only intended to check if anything needed help. I was not looking for Laura, but she found me. She walked over without haste, without hesitation. She called my name loudly enough for those around us to hear. I turned back. Laura said she needed to clarify something. Her voice was calm, not angry, not smiling. She said that starting tomorrow, I needed to understand my position. Daniel now had a new family, that I was no longer the center of my son's life, that from now on decisions would be made by her. She said I had already had my time. Now it was time for me to step back. No one interrupted. No one laughed. I saw a few people look away. I also saw a few stand frozen, unsure how to react. I did not argue. I did not ask where Daniel was. I looked at Laura and listened until she finished. Not because I agreed, but because I needed to hear everything clearly to understand what was happening. When she stopped, I smiled. I said that I understood, nothing more. In that moment, I did not feel ashamed. I did not feel angry either. I felt clarity. Clear that this was no longer a difference in lifestyle or perspective. This was a boundary broken by words, spoken before a large audience. Daniel was not there. Perhaps he did not hear it. Perhaps he would hear about it later in a different way. But I knew that if I stayed silent as if nothing had happened, I would be accepting something I did not believe was right. I did not want to argue on my son's wedding day. I did not want to make a scene. But I understood that there are moments when patience is no longer kindness. It becomes permission for others to go too far. I left the table and walked toward the exit. Before stepping outside, I took my phone from my bag. My hands did not shake. I was not in a hurry. I did exactly one thing that needed to be done, then put the phone away. I left the reception without another word. Not because I walked away in anger, but because I realized that some boundaries, if not held at that exact moment, may never be held again. That night. I came home late. The house was quieter than usual. I did not turn on the main lights, only the small light in the kitchen. I sat down at the table, placed my purse beside me, and sat still for a long time. I took out my phone and reopened the information about the wedding gift. I looked at the number on the screen. It was still there, as it had been for many years. I thought about Daniel. I thought about the look in my son's eyes when I gave him the gift. I also thought about Laura's voice when she said I should step back. I did not feel angry. I felt afraid. My greatest fear was not losing money. I had lived long enough to know that money can be earned again. My fear was losing my son, that a decision made with good intentions could be misunderstood as a form of control or retaliation. I asked myself what I was doing. Was I protecting Daniel, or was I reacting because I was hurt? Was I letting emotion lead me? I stood up, made a cup of tea, then sat down again. I thought about how I had raised my child. I had never used money to force Daniel to obey. I didn't want to start doing that at this age, but there was one thing I could not ignore. If I had given that gift while all boundaries had been erased, I would have been enabling behavior that I did not believe was right. I would be teaching Daniel that disrespect carries no consequences. I sat in front of the phone screen for a long time. Finally, I did what I knew I had to do, even though it was deeply uncomfortable. I withdrew the gift. No announcement, no explanation, just a quiet decision. When it was done, I put the phone down. I did not feel relieved. I did not feel a sense of victory or defeat. I only felt that I had chosen to stand by what I believed was right, even if it meant being misunderstood. I lay down in bed, but I didn't fall asleep right away. In the darkness, I wondered whether Daniel would call me in the morning, whether he would be angry, whether he would think I was interfering in his life. I accepted all of those possibilities. I prayed that if I was wrong, things would soon be corrected. And if I was right, I hoped Daniel would be protected from things he could not yet see. That night passed very slowly. But as dawn approached, I knew I would not change that decision. Not because I was stubborn, but because I couldn't do otherwise and still maintain inner peace. I did not tell Daniel about my decision right away. Not because I was afraid to face him, but because I needed to be sure I was not acting purely on emotion. I have an old friend who once worked in the finance industry. We have known each other long enough for me to trust her discretion. I called her and said I needed to understand Laura better, not to smear her and not to find fault, only to know what I was facing. I made one thing clear. If there was nothing concerning, I would stop immediately. I did not want to become someone who digs into another person's past just to prove myself right. A few days later, my friend called back. Her voice was neither rushed nor light. She said there were a few things that did not sit right. Not obvious wrongdoing, but repeated patterns. Jobs changing frequently. Relationships ending abruptly. A few financial disputes settled quietly. I listened without interrupting. Each piece of information weighed heavier on me, not because I wanted to be right, but because I began to understand that my unease had not come from baseless sensitivity. When the call ended, I sat still for a long time. I looked around my familiar home. I thought about Daniel. I thought about how he would react if I were to tell him all of this. I knew very well. If I spoke plainly, Laura would have the opportunity to say I was sabotaging their marriage, and Daniel, still trusting his wife, would very likely choose her side. I did not want to force my son into choosing sides. I also asked myself a very difficult question. Once you know the truth, should you always speak it immediately? Or are there times when the best thing you can do is wait so the people involved can see it for themselves? I chose the second path, not because I was afraid, but because I believed that if the truth carries weight, it will stand on its own without me forcing it. I did not tell Daniel what I had learned. I kept it to myself and continued to observe. I paid attention to the way Laura talked about money, the way she made decisions for Daniel, things he used to decide on his own. I began to see everything following a very familiar pattern. At times I blamed myself for knowing and remaining silent. But then I remembered what I have always believed. The truth does not need to be shouted. It needs to be seen at the right moment, by the right person. I did not know when that moment would come, but I began to feel very clearly that it was not far away. Daniel called me one weekday afternoon, not to accuse me and not to ask about the wedding gift. He only said he wanted to stop by and talk for a bit. His voice sounded tired. When Daniel arrived, I noticed the difference immediately. He looked thinner. His shoulders were slightly slumped. He sat down at the kitchen table the way he used to when he was little, resting his hand on a glass of water, but not drinking it. He said he hadn't been sleeping well lately. Work was fine, but his mind always felt tense. He said everything at home had been reorganized, accounts, spending, plans. Laura said doing it that way would be better for their future. I didn't react. I just listened. Daniel went on to say that he had started asking for input on things he used to decide on his own, not because Laura forced him, but because if he didn't ask, things would become heavy. He said he didn't want arguments, so he often chose to remain silent. I asked one very simple question. Who manages your accounts now? Daniel was quiet for a few seconds. Then he said that Laura was helping keep track of them, that she was good at those things, that it made things less complicated. I didn't say whether that was right or wrong. I just asked another question. Do you still review your expenses the way you used to? Daniel shook his head. He said he trusted Laura, but when he said it, his voice wasn't steady. A few days later, Daniel called me on his own. This time, his voice was different, calmer but heavier. He said he had reviewed his accounts, that there were a few charges he didn't remember agreeing to, not large but repeated, that when he asked, Laura said they were necessary things, nothing worth worrying about. Daniel didn't say Laura was wrong. He only said that he was beginning to feel like he no longer had control over his own life the way he once did. I didn't give advice. I only said that if he felt uneasy, he had the right to pause and examine the situation more closely, not to accuse anyone, but to understand his perspective. Daniel sat silently for a long time. Then he said something that made me turn away to hide my emotion. Mom, I think I've ignored too many things just because I didn't want to hurt anyone. I placed my hand over my son's hand. I told him that love should not make him shrink himself, that in a healthy relationship, no one should have to trade their peace of mind just to keep the harmony. Daniel nodded. I knew there was a great struggle inside him, not between right and wrong, but between protecting the truth and admitting that he might have made the wrong choice. From that day forward, Daniel began to examine everything more closely, not in a rush, not loudly, just no longer with his eyes closed the way he had before. I didn't know what decision he would come to. I only knew that for the first time in a very long while, Daniel was questioning his own life. And that was what I had been waiting for, even though I never wanted it to come this way. I didn't tell Daniel that I had learned anything more. I didn't bring up the wedding gift again. I just observed. Laura began to change when Daniel no longer nodded immediately at every suggestion. Not in big ways, just very small reactions, a sharper tone, more controlling questions. She asked Daniel where he was going, who he was meeting, what they talked about. Not with jealousy, but with the voice of someone who needed to keep everything firmly in hand. One morning, Laura came to my house, without notice. I was cleaning the kitchen when I heard loud, insistent knocking. When I opened the door, she was standing there, hair hastily tied back, her face tense. She said directly that I was interfering in their marriage, that ever since Daniel talked to me, things at home had no longer been peaceful. She said I had planted doubt in her husband's mind. I didn't argue. I only said that I had never told Daniel what to do. I had only listened when my son spoke. Laura was not satisfied with that answer. Her voice rose. She said that if I truly wanted what was best for Daniel, I should step back, just as she had said at the wedding, that my holding on to the money and keeping my distance were all ways of applying pressure. I looked at Laura for a long time, not to challenge her, but to be sure I was hearing her correctly. She was no longer maintaining her initial politeness. She spoke about money as a right. She spoke about Daniel as part of her plan. I didn't react. I didn't apologize. I only said that I would not transfer any more money, not out of resentment, but because I didn't believe it was the right thing to do. Laura was silent for a few seconds. Then she said something that made me understand that things had gone too far. She said that if I didn't cooperate, she would make Daniel pay. Not emotionally, but financially, through legal bindings that a wife could create. I didn't respond. I only asked her to leave. When the door closed, I stood still for a moment. My heart was racing, but my mind was clear. I knew that from that moment on, Laura was no longer trying to hide anything. She had spoken aloud what had previously existed only in her behavior. That evening, Daniel called me. He said Laura was furious. She said I was tearing their family apart. I asked Daniel just one question. Do you feel safe in your own marriage? Daniel didn't answer right away. After a moment, he said that for the first time, he wasn't sure. I didn't comfort him. I didn't push him either. I only said that if he needed time to think, he had the right to that time. No one has the right to threaten him into staying. After the call, I began to write everything down. Dates, details, not for retaliation, but for protection. I believe that when someone begins to use threats to keep what they want, they will not stop. I didn't know how far Laura would go, but I knew one thing. The mask had fallen, and from that point on, every action would leave a trace. Daniel came to see me the following evening, without notice. When I opened the door, I saw that my son's face was very different. No more hesitation. No more trying to appear fine. He said he needed to talk, not with me first, but with Laura. And he needed to know where I would stand if things went in the worst possible direction. I did not answer right away. I only said that I would stand on the side of the truth no matter how difficult that might be. Daniel nodded. He said that over the past 2 days he had reviewed everything. Accounts, emails, documents, decisions he had once believed were made jointly. Now he was no longer sure. There were expenses approved that he did not remember agreeing to. There were emails he had never read, but that had been answered in his name. Daniel said that when he asked, Laura did not provide an explanation. She accused him of lacking trust, accused him of letting his mother interfere, accused him of hurting their marriage. That night, Daniel talked to Laura. I was not there. I did not need to be. It was a confrontation my son had to face on his own. Daniel later told me that when he asked the first question, Laura tried to stay calm. When he presented evidence, her tone changed. She said everything she did was for their future, that Daniel was too weak to manage things on his own, that without her, he would never get far. When Daniel said he needed to pause and think, Laura disagreed. She said there was no room for hesitation in a marriage, that if Daniel pulled back, she would use every right of a wife to protect her share. Daniel told me that at that moment he no longer heard love in Laura's words. He only heard control and the fear of losing power. The next morning, Daniel called me. His voice was very calm. He said that he had asked Laura to leave for a while, not as punishment, but so he could have space to reflect on his life. Laura did not accept it. She said very harsh things. She threatened that Daniel would pay a price if he did not come back immediately. Daniel said that was when he understood most clearly, not because of what I had worried about before, but because of what he was hearing with his own ears. I did not say, "I told you so." I did not say I was right. I only said that I was proud of him for daring to face the truth, even though it hurt. Daniel was silent for a moment, then said that he was afraid. Not afraid of losing Laura, but afraid of admitting that he had been wrong to ignore the signs from the beginning. I said that anyone can be wrong. What matters is having the courage to stop before the price becomes too high. That night, Daniel stayed at my house. We ate a simple dinner. We did not discuss anything further, but I knew that a very big decision had been made. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a final truth that had finally been called by its right name. The days that followed were not light. They passed slowly and heavily. There was no sense of victory, only the feeling of having to move forward step by step carefully. Daniel began gathering all the documents again, contracts, statements, emails, things he had never imagined having to do with the woman he called his wife. I saw my son exhausted, but this time it was the kind of fatigue that comes with clarity, no longer being swept along. Laura did not remain silent. She called constantly, sent messages. At times she softened her tone, saying everything was just a misunderstanding. At other times she became sharp, saying Daniel was betraying her. I did not answer. Daniel gradually stopped responding as well, not to avoid her, but because things now needed to be handled differently. Daniel went to see a lawyer, not for revenge, but to understand where he stood legally. I went with him to the first meeting. I did not speak much. I just listened. There were moments when things seemed as if they might turn unfavorable. Some documents were unclear. Some decisions had been signed when Daniel had not been fully aware. There were evenings when I saw my son sitting silently, staring into space, as if asking himself how everything had gone so far. I had nights without sleep as well, not because I worried for myself, but because I knew justice does not always come quickly, and I feared that if things dragged on, Daniel would be exhausted before a clear answer was reached. But then, one by one, things were clarified. Not by luck, but because Daniel was willing to face things, willing to ask questions, willing to check carefully. There were things Laura had once stated with great certainty, but when asked to provide proof, they no longer held up. The process was not loud. There were no major arguments, just layers being peeled away, slowly but clearly. At times, Daniel asked me whether it was worth it, whether he should just let things go so everything could end faster. I did not answer for him. I only said that justice does not always feel comfortable. Still, if you ignore the truth just to keep the peace, the price usually comes later, and it is heavier. Daniel nodded. He continued forward. I realized that justice, when it comes in the right way, does not need noise. It only requires enough patience to stand firm in the face of the truth. And in those days, despite all the lingering worries, I saw my son gradually reclaiming the most important thing he had lost, the right to be in control of his own life. As things gradually became clearer, one question many people asked me was, did I hate Laura? My answer was always the same. No, not because I am noble, but because I have lived long enough to understand that resentment holds a person back longer than any toxic relationship. I no longer wanted to carry that, but forgiveness does not mean helping again. Forgiveness also does not mean allowing everything to continue as if nothing ever happened. Laura tried to contact me one more time. Her voice this time was no longer sharp, nor was it confident. She said she had been pushed into a corner, that things were out of control, that if I were willing to help, everything could end, more smoothly for everyone. I listened. I did not interrupt. I did not argue. When she finished speaking, I simply said that I could not do that. Not out of hatred, but because if I continued to intervene with money or concessions, I would be teaching Daniel the wrong lesson. I would be saying that anyone who causes enough harm will eventually be rescued. I told her that I hoped she would find her own path, but not by crossing other people's boundaries. The conversation ended quickly. There were no harsh words, no real apology either. But afterward, I felt lighter. Lighter because I knew I had not betrayed the values I had lived by all my life. Daniel asked me once whether I felt I had been too rigid. I told him that rigidity is not about saying no. It's about being firm. It is about knowing why you are saying no. I had not closed my heart. I had only closed the door that led to being taken advantage of one more time. Forgiveness, to me, is not letting the past continue to control the present. It involves letting go of the desire to punish, while still maintaining boundaries so that the same mistakes are not repeated. I did not wish for Laura to pay a heavy price. I only wished for her to stop hurting others to fill the empty spaces within herself. And more than anything, I wanted Daniel to understand that love should never be built on fear or obligation. If you have to sacrifice your peace to keep a relationship, then it is no longer love. When I said these things, Daniel was silent for a long time. Then he said that for the first time, he understood why I had always said that living with kindness is not about being praised, but about being able to sleep peacefully at night. Things did not return to normal right away. There was no morning when all the cracks simply disappeared. However, as the days passed, I noticed Daniel breathing more easily. My son started returning to his old habits, waking up earlier, cooking for himself, taking walks after work. Very small things, but things he had neglected for a long time. I did not ask much. I was simply there when he needed me. Daniel moved back in with me for a while. We ate dinner together without discussing the past much. Occasionally, he would bring up an old memory, then fall silent. I did not interrupt. I let him speak when he was ready. One evening, Daniel said he felt ashamed, not because the marriage had failed, but because he had not listened to himself sooner. I told him that everyone makes mistakes. What matters is that he stopped before losing himself completely. Time passed. The legal matters were resolved gradually, not quickly, not easily, but clearly. Daniel was no longer pulled into pressuring calls or messages. His life slowly found its own rhythm again. One weekend, Daniel told me he had met someone new, not to start anything serious, just someone he felt comfortable talking to. I didn't ask much. I only said that the most important thing was that he felt at peace around that person. A few months later, I met her. Not in a carefully arranged meeting, just a casual coffee. She greeted me with a very simple smile, not probing, not defensive. She said she knew Daniel had been through a difficult period, and she respected that. That was enough. I did not compare. I did not rush to trust either of them, but I saw Daniel smile more, smiling with ease, not with the caution he once had. And to me, that was the clearest sign of all. My own life changed quietly as well. I spent more time on myself. I walked every morning. I reread old books. I learned how to sit still without worrying about my son's tomorrow. At times, I thought back on everything that had happened. I did not ask myself what if I had done things differently. I only knew that at every difficult moment, I chose what allowed me to keep living without regret. Family, to me, is not a place where people control one another. Family is where people are respected, even when they are older. People do not need to be thanked every day. They only need to be heard and not pushed aside as if they no longer matter. I still believe in kindness. I still believe that goodness, even when quiet, leaves a trace. It is not always immediately visible, but it is there, in the hardest choices. Now, sitting in the familiar kitchen, watching Daniel make coffee for the two of us, I feel at peace. Not because everything is perfect, but because we made it through the storm without losing each other. And if there is one thing I learned from all of this, it is this. Sometimes, love is not about holding on tighter, but about having the courage to keep the right boundaries, so the people you love have the chance to become the best version of themselves.